Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I'm very excited to be talking to my friend, Dr. Greg Potter, once again. For those who aren't aware of Greg, it's been a while since he's been on the show, but Greg has a PhD in sleep. A lot of our early podcast episodes, and we've done a bunch together, were all focused on sleep. However, that isn't where Greg's knowledge is limited to. He is really into the kind of health and longevity kind of spectrum of things. Also, of course, just training, nutrition. He has a wealth of knowledge, and this is what we're diving into in today's episode. We talk about some updates on Greg, what he's been up to. He's working on a variety of really interesting products, including supplements on health and longevity, and working with companies to expand our health span, lifespan, and get us fighting aging as best as possible. And that's a large part of today's discussion. We also dive into some controversies surrounding various supplements, whether or not they're doing anything for us, various genetic and blood tests, and whether or not they're worth investing into, and diving into a bunch of supplements that you might want to consider supplementing to help your anti-aging kind of resilience, as it were. So I think there's just so much detail and loads of practical take-homes, but also just insights and giving us a future thought-provoking look into aging as a whole and what you might be thinking about to do to battle that as best as you can. As ever, guys, if you do enjoy this episode, make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, to the podcast provider that you're listening to it on. If you can, leave us a review, leave us a nice review. It's always appreciated. Drop us a comment. I specifically asked for comments at the end of this episode relating to some future topics that me and Greg are going to be talking about on microplastics and the such. So I think that would be something that would be really beneficial. If you have any thought-provoking questions for us, that'd be fantastic. And as ever, guys, just give us a thumbs up, give us a screenshot, share it over on Instagram, tag us both. We'd highly appreciate it. But without further ado, let's get into the fantastic episode with Dr. Greg Potter. So Greg, we were just talking off air. And well, we've been talking off air a fair bit because we catch up via WhatsApp, which I'm very happy to have that kind of, I guess, access to you. That sounds really weird. I'm glad we're friends off the podcast. There you go. It's a more normal way to phrase things. But it's actually been a while since you've come onto the podcast because of we booked in a podcast a while ago, and life happens. And so I thought it might be nice for the listeners if they probably want a bit of an insight and update on Greg and all things, what's happening in Greg's world, because you're always on adventures and doing fun things, although you're situated far too close to me for your comfort probably right now.
They might have forgotten who I am, Steve. So I'm not too sure that anyone will care for an update about me. But yeah, quite a lot's changed. And as you alluded to, I've done a lot of traveling in the last year or so. I'm not sure the last time that we spoke, but it was probably over a year ago. And since then, I spent a lot of my time in Asia working and traveling at the same time, which has been a lot of fun and has caused plenty of headaches and a few infections, but that's all part of the fun. And then obviously I have been involved in several projects. The most important of those and the most time consuming is I'm the CSO, the Chief Science Officer. Sounds very fancy, for a startup based in the US, which is making longevity supplements. So I lead the formulation of those products, and we've got our first product coming out this year. Plan is for Q2, but that's forever a moving target, usually related to manufacturing or label issues, which is frustrating, but we're patient. And then in addition to that, I am working with a psychiatry clinic based in London, so I do a lot of work helping people with their sleep, and then in conjunction with that, their mental health. I am working with a business called Becoming, which basically runs retreats for high net worth people, and I do some coaching there, as well as delivering some sessions on various different things like mindset and the role of lifestyle and general health. And then still doing a little bit of coaching, and I'm likely going to be starting work shortly with a business that's trying to forecast change in people's health based on information about them, including demographic information, their electronic health records, their lifestyle, and so on. The idea being that if you can anticipate what that person's likely to suffer from, then you can intervene early, which ultimately extends someone's health span, potentially their lifespan, but also results in massive economic savings. And you can see the advantage of integrating something like that with a healthcare system like the NHS or the system in the US.
So much going on actually on your end, which is really, really exciting. Lots of things, like I have so many thoughts on many of the things you mentioned, but immediate thought that comes to mind is I'm always surprised, not surprised. There's a few things I'm like, at school, they should really have nutritional literacy, a little bit more financial literacy. And then one of them is like, again, like you said, looking at someone's health background and history of kind of within the family, because as a child and into your teens, into your 20s, you're not really thinking about any of that. It's not until around maybe 30s you start thinking, oh, actually, like, I don't know, I had this person within my family pass away from X, Y, like they suffered from this. And then and I don't know if it's probably not too late, but maybe you could have done something about it earlier to help yourself. So I think that sounds like a really important thing that company are doing and that you're going to help them with.
Yeah, and you've probably had this experience too, but it feels to me like when I got into my 30s, suddenly people around me started falling apart. And I myself felt like I'm not invincible for the first time. In the last year or so, for example, I've had 4 ear infections and I've had food poisoning several times. And I've been burnt by a scooter, which resulted in an infected cut. Just all this kind of thing that takes place when you're living in Southeast Asia. But much more importantly, I've lost several people close to me, 2 to cancer, 1 to an acute cardiovascular event. And those people are all relatively young, between the age of 34, 51. And you therefore start to shift your priorities a little bit. And you start viewing things slightly differently too. And I suppose that brings us to the subject of today's conversation, which might seem uninteresting at first blush to some people because it's not just focusing on maximizing muscle hypertrophy or fat loss or what have you, but it's very important to long-term progress, but also to living what you perceive to be a good life so that you can look back on things at the end of it all and think, yeah, I did a good job.
Yeah, I absolutely relate to you. My nan last year died from cancer, and I forget how many years before that was my granddad passed away. But it is kind of getting to that age, and similar to you, had people very close who suffered some illnesses that you're like, ah, never happened to me. I forget the statistic; you'll probably know better, but I think it's 1 in 3 like have cancer at some point during their life. And whenever I hear that, I'm like, man, I know way too many people to have none of them have suffered anything close to that. And so it's I don't know why it's kind of that ignorance of being young that lots of those issues are like age related. So
Yeah.
you're much more likely to suffer them later in life. You're like, oh, you just think it's the same through the years, but no, the body degrades and these risks become larger. So I do think it's a important topic, and I mean it seems to be growing, the interest. I guess, would you say that too? I don't know if it's just podcast platforms and social media is growing, so it's making it way more accessible, but I think it for good reason. There's people
Yeah.
coming up that are trying to do things like you are, and with your podcast, which you didn't mention actually, things that you're still doing or projects that you're working on. Your
Yeah.
podcast is still
Oh, yeah.
going, so I'm sure there'll be a chunk of people listening to this that tune into your podcast every week or
Thanks.
whenever you release.
Thanks
It's
for
not quite weekly, is it?
No, it's not. It's a little bit irregular, but it's certainly at least once a month. So thank you for plugging that as opposed to me shamelessly doing so. But I agree. I think people's interest in longevity in general has surged in the last few years. There are probably a few different factors that are at play. One of them is just that a lot of people who've been in the game for a while are getting older. And so their interests start to shift. And as they see their hair fall out and their hair grey and the wrinkles deepen, they start thinking, man, I want to look like I'm 25 again. And what can I do about that? So I think some of it, frankly, is driven by vanity, but that isn't a negative thing because if people then start to intervene in positive ways, then ultimately it's good for them in general. Another factor is that as people are getting older, the billionaires are getting older and they want to live forever. They've got everything apart from immortality. And so a lot of them have started to pump cash into startups intended to better understand the biology of aging and what you can do to intervene. Going back to what you were saying, the geroscience hypothesis, geroscience just being the study of getting older, of aging, is that if you can understand the fundamental processes that are driving aging and target those processes, then you can ward off multiple age-related diseases concurrently. Because, as you mentioned, age is the strongest risk factor for many diseases, including cancer. And so the net effect of all of this interest and all of that fresh money being pumped into geroscience and these startups, hopefully, will be very positive. Because if we do come up with geroprotective interventions, which are protecting people against aging, so slowing aging, or gerotherapies, which are actually potentially taking people with quite advanced age and reversing the age, the biological age of some of their organs and tissues, and then in turn improving their health, then that could do a huge amount of good. So the difficulty is trying to sort the wheat from the chaff and work out who has a vested interest, whether you can trust those people, what the science really shows without us overreaching, and what makes sense at this point of time in terms of things that you might want to dabble with if you do want to slow the rate at which you're aging, but also understanding that there are always trade-offs at play. And so some of the things that you might do to intervene could have some negative repercussions, which we might come to later.
Yeah, that immediately reminds me of a phrase I probably say far too often on the podcast. For every gimme, there's a gotcha. I don't know why that phrase. It's so easy to just think of, and yeah, obviously people want all the upside without the downside. I don't know if it's worth as like establishing a baseline. I guess I don't know if it even does establish a baseline. You'll be able to tell us. But in terms of the hallmarks of aging, I don't know if that's a good place to start and what you think of the hallmarks of aging.
Sure. Yeah. So to provide some background to this, scientists have for a long time tried to come up with different theories of aging, and you can split those in different ways. You could look at theories according to whether they're trying to explain why we age or mechanistically how we age, or you can split them according to the nature of the mechanisms that are at play. So some of them focus on the wear and tear that accumulates with aging and how that contributes to dysfunction, whereas some of them focus on the idea that aging on some level is programmed by genetics, and we need to better understand that if we want to ward off aging. But if we put those theories to the side, then 12 years or so ago, 12 to 14 years ago, scientists convened and came up with an initial set of the hallmarks of aging, which are processes that are drivers of aging as opposed to passengers of aging. And so what they basically did was got together and write a narrative review article, which really reflected their personal interests and biases and the processes that they thought were driving aging. And it's a good list of processes, and I can spell out what all of those are. And then a couple of years ago, that set of hallmarks was updated based on developments in the literature since then. And if you look at the individual processes, then there are a few criteria that they need to meet. So one of them is that if you amplify the process in question, then you accelerate aging, and in turn you would shorten lifespan. Another is that if you dial down the process in question, then you should retard aging and extend lifespan. And another is that they're conserved across different species. So a lot of the basic biology into aging has started with lots of model organisms, typically budding yeast, roundworms, fruit flies, and C57 black 6 male mice, each of which is useful in its own way, but trying to extrapolate findings from that research to humans is not straightforward, doesn't always work, and we need to bear in mind the substantial limitations of each of those model organism systems. But I'll pause there just because I don't know if you want me to actually explain what the hallmarks are, or if you want to pick up on anything regarding their limitations or what have you.
Yeah, I guess it's like you said, the hallmarks of aging. It's not like the scientific rigor of those is a narrative review, like you said, reflecting people's biases and interests. So it's not like these are the hallmarks of aging in sense of that sense. So I don't know how useful it is to know them, apart from, I mean, like the adding to it, the changing and editing the list. So
Yeah.
I am happy for you to guide the conversation to what you think is going to be most beneficial to the listener versus just explaining them for the sake of it.
So I think a couple of analogies could be helpful here. One that's been put forward is that you can imagine them as being a bit like a map of aging. If you think about early maps of planet Earth, a lot of people, flat earthers back then, thought that the Earth looked a certain way, and they might have had some of the continents in roughly the right place, but they were missing really important large land masses. And over time, that map has got better, and we've added to it and we've repositioned some things. And so I'd say that this early set of the hallmarks of aging could be thought of as being a bit like that, where maybe you've got several of the continents, but you might be missing one or two, and missing many islands. Some of them are too big and some of them are too small, and so on. But maybe a more helpful analogy is to think of them as being a bit like a network, because the reality is that if you target one of the hallmarks, then you affect all of the other nodes in the network. And that interaction between them is really interesting and quite poorly understood too, but has lots of different implications. There are other issues at play too, like tissue specificity and the degree to which you want to target individual hallmarks, because there's probably something of a trade-off between the hallmarks and their involvement in aging, but also some positive effects of those processes on things like keeping cancer in check. So during the course of evolution, we've probably towed a fine line between those two things, and therefore aggressively targeting certain hallmarks, and some of them come to mind like telomere attrition and cellular senescence, might be misguided. And instead, for people with, say, a large burden of senescent cells, it might make sense to try and use something like a senolytic to get rid of them. But if you're 35 years old and you're taking a high dose of fisetin or quercetin plus dasatinib to try and get rid of existing senescent cells in your body, then hypothetically you could be disposing yourself to something like cancer. So there are some hallmarks that I'm much more confident targeting with many people, but others that I think it would be misguided to focus on at this point in time.
It sounds like there's a lot we don't quite know, and so I guess that's what the billionaires are trying to figure out and invest all their money in. And I mean, obviously Brian Johnson is the one that comes to mind when I think about that, and how he's, in some ways, he's using himself as a test subject, which I kind of appreciate, because it's pretty hard to find people that are willing to do it, but also I guess you need a huge amount of capital, and if anyone's going to live longer, you want it to be you. So it kind of makes sense for him to have a personal bias that way.
Yeah, and I followed Johnson a bit early on before he had his squillions of followers and his Netflix documentary. And back then, the early stages of his YouTube channel and project, I thought it was all quite interesting. And he was very serious about it. And then over time, appearance management has become more and more important. And the nature of the content that he's putting out there has shifted a lot. And he now has his blueprint product range. And I saw on Twitter, refused to call it X, recently, that he's hiring lots of people because they're generating very large amounts of revenue from selling those products, some of which I don't love. And so I've got quite mixed feelings about Brian Johnson. But as we've discussed via WhatsApp previously, I think he's probably had a net positive effect, as is true of so many people. And so it's easy to throw someone like him under the bus and focus on some of his personal limitations. But I still think he's probably actually been a force for good, even if I find myself saying that reluctantly.
I know, I don't know if this is, yeah, I think it's fine to say, I'm not a size of podcast where this is a problem, and I don't think it's a problem anyway. People have taken shots at like an Andrew Huberman, for example, because he's kind of, I think, actually said some misinformation that potentially could be harmful. Or I had another person that came to mind, but he's gone out of my one ear out the other. But in the same kind of vein, a net positive like Andrew Huberman, I think you'd probably agree, a net positive for the kind of for everyone.
Yeah, definitely. I'm a fan of Andrew Huberman. I don't listen to his podcast that much, but I'm a fan of him because I think fundamentally he's a decent guy. I think he's likable. I think he's very hardworking, and I think he's done a huge amount to popularize science. But I also think that the quality of the content that he puts out there has shifted a little bit over time. And as you move away from academia into focusing on your podcast, and that becomes your whole gig, you have to monetize it, and you have all sorts of considerations that you didn't have previously, and that can dilute the quality of some of the information you put out there. And it can also tie you to certain businesses that in retrospect you might not want to be tied to. And I'm not going to necessarily name names, but if you listen to a lot of the most popular health podcasts and health adjacent podcasts out there, then they tend to push certain products, like an electrolyte product and like a greens product. And the quality of some of those is dubious at best. And they aren't products that I personally would align myself to. And there are other products that are now entering those market spaces that are pitching themselves alongside those earlier products and talking about their superiority. But fundamentally, they're the same types of products. They're inexpensive to make. They've got massive margins. And that's why they can pay their scientist influencers large amounts of cash per sale and make the whole business model work. But I do feel for consumers because they're trying to sift through all this information, and it's a deluge of information without relevant training necessarily, without understanding that someone like Andrew Huberman isn't an expert in everything that he speaks about by any means. In many instances, he's read a couple of review articles and he's putting out a podcast based on that, based on maybe a conversation or two with a colleague that is an expert in it. And so we just have to bear in mind the shortcomings of individuals. And obviously that includes looking at ourselves and recognizing that we're often wrong about things too. I'm sure that if I listened to some conversations that I'd had several years ago, I'd think, that's not quite right. You're an idiot. That was totally wrong.
I agree. I think that's part of the base of that is that's evidence-based, is updating, like science is always getting us closer to the truth. It's not like black and white. It's kind of just giving us clue-ins and it's nudging us in a certain direction most of the time. So I think it's good that you can look back, and I think it's a bad sign if you look back at everything you said. Yeah, I agree with everything I said a decade ago. I'd be a little bit concerned that you weren't keeping up with the times because we're continually learning. But I agree with you that it's challenging. The biggest concern for me with those podcasts and when they are recommending those supplements, which at best they're doing very little, is that people then focus on those and it takes away from investments into other things that could be actually benefiting them much more. And I know in the fitness industry, it's like you called a sellout if you go down that route too far. And so it does feel a little bit like that. But I think if it could somehow fuel better work and keep Andrew doing his good work and Brian doing the right thing in terms of investigating these things, and it's not having too many negatives, it could be a net positive. But that's a tricky one to even delve into too much. And I think we'll probably, I don't know if you have anything more to say on that, or we can dive into further of our discussion here.
Well, I was just thinking about how people should approach the curation of the information that they're interested in. And I haven't anticipated speaking about this, but I do think there are a lot of people who just subscribe to a podcast and then listen to everything that podcast puts out. And you and I want people to do that with our respective podcasts. But you might do that with some podcasts, and that's great. Like if you're interested in physique training, absolutely subscribe to the Revive Stronger podcast. It's the best out there. But I don't necessarily think that the most popular shows, the most listened to shows are the best. And I also think that people can approach it in an alternative way, which is searching for podcasts based on the people who are on the podcast and based on the nature of the subject matter. And also trying to identify gaps in their knowledge in advance and then approach the whole thing more systematically. So sometimes just pausing and stepping back and then trying to work out what you're interested in and what you think would be beneficial to learn about can be really helpful in the long term.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. I think a good chunk of, especially your audience, but also the people listening here, will do that, where they'll seek that out, because even I've had times of which, well, I mean, I get people reaching out to me via email, being like, "Oh, bring on this person, bring on this person." It's just I don't, and I do see myself as having some responsibility with the guests that I bring on. Not that like they have my kind of stamp of approval in some sense, but I take that responsibility seriously. And at times, I've maybe had people on that I wouldn't again, or what have you, but it's very rare that would happen. But at the same time, I have gaps in my knowledge, hence maybe having brought someone on that isn't always espousing the best information.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So we'll jump on, like you said, we didn't have that discussion planned, although I think people will appreciate it, having especially your thoughts on that, Greg. But we'll jump on to organs. So thinking about the fact that they age at different rates and what the kind of overall implications might be for our health and longevity with that in mind.
Sure. Yeah, so this is an idea that's come to the fore in the last couple of years, largely initially driven by a brilliant scientist at Stanford called Tony Whisker. He published a paper in one of the Nature journals showing, based on an analysis of the proteome, which is the sum of different proteins in a biological sample like blood, that if you look at proteins that correspond to different organs, then different organs are aging at different rates between individuals, as you might expect. But also, that predicts risk of relevant health outcomes. And so some of his work showed that a heart that was aging faster was associated with increased risk of subsequent cardiovascular disease, and a heart and a brain that were aging faster were associated with increased risk of Alzheimer's disease in years to come. And since then, there have been a few analyses with similar findings. So Vadim Gladyshev, who's at Harvard, published some work showing broadly the same. And Linda Partridge, who was on that initial Hallmarks of Aging paper, who's a brilliant scientist based in London, published some work recently in one of the Lancet journals, showing again the same broad findings, but also interestingly showing that it's not necessarily that if you're seeing the changes in the proteins that correspond to kidney function, you're just at higher risk of kidney diseases. It seems that if one organ is aging faster, that can affect risk of future diseases that people would anticipate as being driven by other organs. And it could be that the aging of certain organs has more widespread effects on risk of other diseases that relate to different organs than aging in other organs. So, for example, it could be, based on her analysis, that people with arteries that are aging quickly and kidneys that are aging quickly disposes them to many different age-related chronic diseases, whereas that's less true of certain other organs. And looking at her data, which looked at 45 different chronic diseases, they could somewhat predict risk of 30 of those, so 2/3 of those based on the aging of organs. However, of those 30, only a fifth, so 6 diseases, were strongly predicted by aging in the relevant organ. And so what we're seeing is that when one organ ages quickly, it's having effects that are quite remote to the location of that organ. And some of that probably relates back to the hallmarks of aging, because the hallmarks of aging focus very much on what's going on within and around cells. And so, as an example of this, one of them that was added to the original set is chronic inflammation. And acute inflammation can be helpful. It can help you respond adaptively to things like burns and infections. But if the fire of the immune system carries on for too long, then there's a lot of adjacent damage that comes with that. And so ideally, you would have that type of acute inflammatory response and then be able to dial down that immune activity. Whereas in chronic low-grade inflammation, it continues, and then some of these circulating inflammatory factors, cytokines and so on, will circulate in the blood and then have effects remote to wherever they were produced. And that kind of thing probably in part explains why dysfunction in one tissue is affecting many other tissues within the system. So the implication is that if we can better understand which organs are aging, then we might be able to target those more selectively. It's something that people need to bear in mind if they're looking at anti-aging supplements that are intended to target these hallmarks of aging, because there are lots of them that are on the market now, and they tend to focus on those hallmarks. We target telomere attrition using this. We target mitochondrial dysfunction using this. We target genomic instability using this. If you actually look at the research that's based on, it's often in vitro or it's in vivo using one of these model organ systems, but it's only looking at certain tissues. And the reality is that not everything gets into every tissue. And so really we need to start thinking about things at different levels in terms of the hallmarks of aging and what's going on within cells and between cells. One of the hallmarks, for example, that's been added recently is dysbiosis, which doesn't focus so much on what's going on within cells, but obviously we have bacteria and fungi and viruses covered all over us, and within that, within the digestive tract and so on. And therefore, it's not really about what's going on within cells, but it's another example of something that's going to have quite far-ranging consequences. And this is part of the reason why people are interested nowadays in things like whether the gut microbiota affects brain function, and then whether you can influence the gut microbiota to thereby improve mood and cognition. So it certainly will have some bearing on the development of different interventions to ward off aging. And I think in the future, we'll be able to better target certain tissues, bearing in mind that some chronic diseases seem to be quite closely tied to dysfunction in the relevant tissue. But we also need to much better understand that crosstalk between tissues. And for now, I think what we're already seeing and what we'll continue to see is products brought to market that claim to assess rate of aging or biological age in different tissues. So you, Steve, send off a blood sample to one of these businesses and they give you a report back based on the contents of that blood sample that your brain age is 32 and your bone age is 29 and your skeletal muscle age is 26, but your heart age is 38. What do you do with that information? They make some money out of it, which is great, but you as a consumer, you're often left stranded because we don't really have the ability to intervene appropriately just yet. So we'll continue to see that. And going back to something you said at the start, family history is informative. I know that within my family, there is a history of cardiovascular disease. I know that Potter males, for whatever reason, tend to end up getting arrhythmias. And so I need to look after my heart. And actually, I turned 35 recently, as you did. And that
Not
was
yet.
in...
Soon.
Oh, not yet.
This year, yeah. You've aged me.
Oh, sorry.
Couple of months' time. Soon.
Couple of months. Send Steve some nice presents in a couple of months. But when I turned 35, I started reflecting on that and I started to shift around my training a little bit accordingly. And so I think considering your family history and then in the future using some of these measures could be quite instructive in terms of how you modify your lifestyle and possibly any pharmaceuticals that you take to help protect you in the future against some of these age-related diseases.
Really interesting. I'm just thinking off the top of my head completely. You mentioned obviously the arrhythmia that's within the Potter household or household family line. Is there anything we can do to get that information without just having to talk to family members at the moment?
I don't think so. I think you have to look at health records. But obviously, the idea in the future is that you'd be able to take one of these simple tests and then have a really strong grasp of what you are disposed to, particularly when that's coupled with other information about you. Are you a smoker? What's your biological sex? What does your diet look like in terms of its composition and timing? What's your sleep quality like, your duration, your regularity? What are your environmental exposures? What are your patterns of light exposure? What's the air quality like around you? All these different factors combine to influence your susceptibility to these different outcomes.
Yeah, it's funny when I think about what you've mentioned there, not funny, but I recently did a blood test. Actually, we talked about it, and I think those have only become relatively recent in terms of accessibility to it. Maybe over the last decade, they've started to grow, and that information that like the practitioners are providing you at that company is getting better. And they ask you, I've done what I did one maybe 5 years ago, and the one I did this time around, they asked me certainly more questions surrounding, like you said, lifestyle factors, so they can provide me better information. It's actually funny, the latest one I did said that losing some weight might help with my longevity, which actually might not be completely wrong, I don't know, but it was funny just kind of having that advice, considering where I am in terms of body composition. Do you have thoughts on that, Greg?
I do, yeah. I've always got thoughts. Yeah.
Yes.
My thoughts are just that it probably does in certain tissues. And so, relevant to a lot of people listening to this, that could affect your joint longevity. If your body mass is higher, you're putting larger loads through your joints, you're just going to increase the strength of those connective tissues because they respond to those types of mechanical signals. But you're probably also going to get greater joint degeneration over time. But if you lost weight and then, because you're already very lean, you therefore lost a lot of skeletal muscle tissue, then that is going to reduce the buffer that you have against age-related frailty. And so a unifying way to think about how to approach aging is thinking about it in terms of what the World Health Organization calls intrinsic capacities. And this is something that I think we've probably discussed briefly before, but the idea is that when you're young, and at any point in life, really, you're trying to push your intrinsic capacities as high as possible because inevitably, as time passes, they are going to fade. For instance, a lot of people, they're going to reach their peak strength capacity in their 20s. If you're training, it's probably going to be later than that. It's probably going to be in your 30s for a lot of people. You're going to reach your peaks in different cognitive functions at different times, your reaction time, your working memory, and so on. How well you regulate your body temperature is going to change over time. It's going to be quite poor when you're an infant. It's going to be very good in young adulthood. And then it's going to get worse as you get older. And so what you're trying to do is make sure that you challenge all of these capacities to help buffer you against frailty in any one of those capacities. And with strength, this is really easy to explain. You can think of it in terms of activities of daily living. You require a certain amount of strength to stand up from a low chair. You require a certain amount of joint range of motion to be in that squat position too. And if over time you're losing muscle mass, you're getting weaker, and your joint range of motion is getting smaller and smaller, there might come a point where you no longer have enough of one of those capacities to engage in that activity of daily living. And as that happens, ultimately you're going to lose your independence. Then you can have this vicious cycle of frailty where you become more dependent on other people, you stop using your body as much, you then accelerate the rate at which you're losing those capacities, and then your prognosis is not very good. And so you're trying to always challenge these different capacities, and this has relevance for the best way to approach your health in general. Bodybuilders, for instance, are probably very good at challenging their strength reserves and building that intrinsic capacity, but maybe not so good at building their cardiorespiratory fitness. Or maybe they're very good at challenging their joint range of motion, but they're not challenging their cognitive capacities that much because the work that they do is quite rote. They could do it in their sleep. They've been doing it for a while. It's so routine that it really doesn't challenge them that much. And so you can think of this And you could do some sort of a needs analysis for yourself based on, right now, my capacities are roughly here. And clearly, I've got a lot of reserve there in my strength capacity, but that's less true of my cardiovascular system. And I know that I've, within my family, had a couple of heart attacks, a couple of arrhythmias, a couple of strokes. And so maybe I can try and retain that capacity, my strength capacity, but just start to shift my training around a little bit so that I'm pushing up that one at the same time. Or maybe I'm going to carry on doing the work that I'm doing because it's paying the bills. And that's incredibly important because I've got a chunky mortgage. But I've got a little bit of downtime each day. Maybe it's at the start of your day before the rest of the world is up, or maybe it's at the end of the day, you've got young kids, you just put them to bed. Well, I could learn a language, even if it's just using Duolingo for 10 minutes or something like that. You can start to challenge yourself in a relevant way.
That makes a lot of sense. So much sense, actually. And yeah, it just makes me think of things I could be doing to improve kind of that, I guess, health and longevity of myself. But also with what we mentioned in terms of the blood results, I do think the information that's being provided and feedback is better than it was, but it's still taken quite a bit of time. Whereas it's what you're alluding to here is they can give you some sort of information. I don't know the accuracy of that information, like if that blood work. I know like genetic testing is something that's becoming more popular, and so I also don't know the accuracy of that. But then it's all good having accurate information, but if you can't do anything with it that's practical, it's similar to what you've spoken about a lot with these smartwatches and fitness devices that are giving you insights into maybe your sleep or what have you. But if they're not giving you any useful practical tips of how now to use that, you're just gathering information for the sake of it.
I think in some instances, people don't know the validity of those measures, even people working within those companies. In some cases, the results don't seem to be reproducible. I know people who have sent in the same sample multiple times and found quite different results.
Wow.
Or have taken a sample and they've sent it off to different testing companies for the same outcome of interest, like biological age. Just briefly, people in geroscience differentiate chronological age from biological age. Chronological age being the number of birthdays that you have, assuming that you weren't born during a leap year and on February 29th or whatever. And then biological age is really how your body looks relative to peers. And you might find, for example, that your biology looks more similar to peers who are 4 years younger than your chronological age, in which case your biological age would be 4 years younger. But going back to the organ aging approach to this, it's likely that you have many different biological ages, and therefore people like Gladyshev are interested in whether you can take some sort of composite of that as a proxy of organismal biological age, and then whether that predicts, say, all-cause mortality. And based on the early work, that does seem to be the case. So just remind me, Steve, what I was discussing before I went off on that tangent. I apologize. I'm still jet lagged.
That's all right. It was the kind of efficacy of those tests. I think you said even the people who are working on them, they don't even know if, like, say the test comes back and says your heart's the age of a biological age of a 29-year-old. Is it, or is it like a 10% like margin of error, or is it 50%?
So going back to genetic testing, which you mentioned, historically, the research tended to show that if you give people information about their genetics, it doesn't necessarily modify relevant behaviors. And in some instances, if it didn't modify the relevant behaviors and it did make people stressed out about their genetic information, so let's say they were looking at ApoE alleles, which are known to relate to risk of vascular issues and Alzheimer's disease too, people found out that they were an E4 carrier, which is the highest risk variant. Then if it just stressed them out about that, but they didn't make a bunch of protective lifestyle changes off the back of that, then that's having a net negative effect. So I'm not saying that will always be the case, but that is an issue with genetic testing historically. If they are providing better information, personalized guidance, maybe more important than that, ways to support people to enact the relevant behavior changes, then that would be a good thing. Because typically with these testing companies, you just get some sort of PDF, which is like a shopping list of information about your biology, but it doesn't then support you to make changes to your, say, nutrition or to your physical activity. So that's clearly a stark limitation of those. And the utility of these tests depends on the test in question, of course. I don't think that right now biological age tests are very helpful. I think if you've got deep pockets and you approach this as a game of sorts and you want to take those measures, then that's fine. If you're standardizing the conditions in which you take them, biological age, for example, seems to fluctuate over the course of the day. And whether that's truly the case or whether that just reflects noise within these tests isn't entirely clear. It could relate to something within the biological clockwork, but we don't know at the moment. So you've got to bear that in mind. And there are some tests that we know a huge amount about relative to other tests, like you've just had some blood work done. Great. We know a lot about how to interpret that information. But as I was saying to you, Steve, taking blood from the vein in someone's arm is not the same as taking a capillarized blood sample from someone's finger. And the blood has quite different composition. The blood in your finger being capillarized is probably somewhat reflective of the blood that's being delivered to cells. And based on that, you might think that actually it might be more helpful because that's giving you some information about what is being delivered to those cells as opposed to stuff that's already been used. But most of the research historically has been done on samples taken from the arm, say, as if you were just going to see the nurse at your local GP practice. And we can't assume that the capillarized blood samples perfectly map to blood taken the alternative way. So we just have to bear in mind some of those nuances. But I think for people who are interested in doing some testing, what I mentioned, which is standardizing the conditions in which you take those tests, which would typically be fasted early in the day, same time of day, in particular, the same time of day relative to your sleep. So thinking about trying to standardize the time of the biological day. And when sedentary, after having rested for several minutes and so on, as opposed to straight after doing a Wingate test, that's going to help reduce the noise and help you make sense of that information.
So at the moment, I guess, like you said, in terms of people listening, if they're interested in these tests, only if you have a large pot of money that you want to delve into and understand, like you said, it's a bit of a game. It's nothing. It's not. It maybe is going to be more beneficial to get like general health blood work done, like I maybe got, versus now getting a biological aging test or a genetic test. Yeah. You also mentioned supplements. Obviously, you mentioned, unfortunately, some of the things that are being promoted aren't doing too much. What are some supplements that you think maybe are beneficial for people who are trying to extend their lifespan?
That's a good question. So it's a very interesting sector for all sorts of reasons. And if you listen to the most popular influencers in this world, some of them are geroscientists, some of them are people who have moved from academic roles into industry, some of them are physicians. Everyone has a different take on this. And a lot of people, they focus on the things that have been proven to be most efficacious in model organisms, typically in studies of rodents. A lot of the research uses those C57 black 6 mice, or the ITP, the interventions testing program, uses UM-Het3 mice, which are more genetically heterogeneous, but they're still not a particularly diverse set of animals. And there are some things that have consistently extended lifespan across different species. And the most discussed of these, and the one with the strongest evidence viewed through that lens, is rapamycin, which is an mTOR inhibitor. And if people haven't heard of rapamycin and they hear mTOR inhibition, then they probably immediately start thinking about their gains, because mTOR signaling is important to the growth of skeletal muscle in response to resistance training. And that is relevant in this conversation, because I think that while rapamycin holds a lot of promise for some people, I question how some of these things are going to interact with people's lifestyles. So another candidate gerotherapeutic is metformin, the diabetes drug. It's been around for a long time. We know huge amounts about it. It's very safe. It's a great drug. It's really, really helpful for a lot of people. And not just diabetes, but some related conditions like PCOS and others. And because we know so much about it, and because at the level of the population, it was thought there's some signal between people taking metformin and how long they live, and because of some potential relevant mechanisms, one of the hallmarks of aging is deregulated nutrient sensing, for instance, and that involves changes in pathways like AMPK and mTOR, and metformin is affecting that some of those pathways as rapamycin is. People thought, well, metformin is going to be a good candidate. It didn't perform very well in lifespan assays. It didn't necessarily extend the lifespan of mice, for instance. One of the issues with metformin that's been shown in the last few years is that it blunts adaptations to endurance training and to resistance training. And so in the case of endurance training, people had smaller gains in VO2 max. They had smaller improvements in insulin sensitivity, smaller change in mitochondrial function too. In the case of rapamycin, it hasn't been so well tested. There's really very little clinical research on rapamycin. But we do know, based on studies of other animals, there's a commonly used model of inducing muscle hypertrophy in other animals called synergist ablation. So basically, you could cut one muscle and thereby overload all of the adjacent muscles because they've got to take on a bigger proportion of the loading, and the muscles respond as you would expect by hypertrophying a lot. But based on some of those models, and also some work that's been done on humans looking at the effects of contraction on muscle protein synthetic responses, it seems that rapamycin blunts muscle protein synthetic responses to muscle contractions. And you might assume that that would also reduce hypertrophic responses to lifting weights. That hasn't been tested yet, but we need to watch that space. And going back to what I was saying about building intrinsic capacities, I just think, are these things going to translate well to people? Another consideration is something like rapamycin is affecting immune function substantially. So the way that it's used clinically is to keep the immune system in check during organ transplantation. So if you needed a new organ for some reason, Steve, you might be given sirolimus or everolimus, some sort of rapamycin or rapalog, in order to help your body cope with that massive change in your biology. But could that affect people's risk of developing certain infections if rapamycin is tamping down immune activity? It's plausible. And that brings us to the organisms that are studied and the conditions that they live in. Because a lot of them, take the example of mice, are housed in conditions where there aren't specific pathogens that could pick them off that they would really struggle with. They're called specific pathogen-free conditions. And that, plus the fact that they're often housed in isolation and they don't have sex, like they remain virgins throughout their lifetimes. They're given standardized chow, they're given standardized light dark cycles, and so on. It's just not ecologically valid. It doesn't represent the human condition remotely. So if rapamycin is extending lifespan in those conditions, but it's potentially reducing physical resilience, robustness, it's disposing people to frailty because of those negative effects on skeletal muscle, and it's quieting the immune system, which could influence immune activity at times when you need the immune system to be dialed up. Is that going to work well in the context of our lived conditions? I don't know. So that's a very long-winded way of saying that I'm not sure about how well some of the most popular gerotherapeutics are going to translate to people. And it could be that some of the ones that are actually clinically most effective aren't targeting the biology of aging necessarily, but they do have the strongest effects on lifespan. And I think that's going to be true of the GLP-1 agonists and some of these obesity medications that are targeting not just GLP-1, but related pathways. Many of them are targeting multiple targets in the brain now. And by targeting multiple pathways, they're producing greater weight loss than targeting GLP-1 alone, for instance. Just look at tirzepatide versus semaglutide. Tirzepatide, which is targeting more targets, is producing faster weight loss, sure enough. And it could get to the point where people are actually losing weight too quickly, and then they're losing loads of fat-free mass, and we don't want that. So there's a lot of dose optimization and so on that needs to take place there. But in our obesogenic conditions, where having too much fat mass is upstream of loads of issues, including the biology of aging, because if you've just got this huge energy overload that's always coming in, then that's going to drive a huge amount of dysfunction, chronic inflammation, and so on. Then by reducing food intake and improving body composition, it could be that something like semaglutide, which is known to most people as Ozempic or Wegovy, is actually going to be a better lifespan extender than rapamycin is. And so we have to consider the individual. And if you take a punter from the general public who has a BMI of 30, is relatively sedentary, for that person, something like Ozempic could work wonders. For someone who is generally quite health conscious and doesn't do large amounts of training, has good health but not ideal health, and who uses rapamycin in a very judicious way, including being very particular about the timing of use, because it could be that the timing of metformin and rapamycin is really important. So if you took them before resistance training, then maybe they're going to block how you respond to the training. But if you're training 2 days a week and you take them on off days only, in the case of rapamycin, you might take it once a week typically, then you might be able to get the upsides of use without the downsides. So there are lots of nuances regarding things like dosing and interactions that we need to better understand. And then that brings us to, what do I think are actually good candidates that are supplements that are readily available as opposed to pharmaceuticals? But that was quite a long answer already, so I'm just going to shut up briefly and ask if you've got anything you want to pick up on.
It just reminds me of what you mentioned at the start there, where there's these interactions that many people aren't necessarily thinking about. And I think that's where obviously GPL1s are like in vogue, especially within the space that I'm in. And
are they banned?
Interestingly enough, I think for WADA, which is a lot of what the natural federations look at, I don't think they are right now banned. Actually, I thought they were banned during competition, but off-season they could be used, which is kind of strange. I could see maybe applications to like a recovery period post-show. They could be particularly helpful in that phase to like manage people not going wild. So gaining fat too rapidly essentially and rebounding. But as far as I last looked at it, I think they're being looked at but not banned in at least the federations I've looked at.
Yeah, I imagine that low doses, well below those that have been used clinically, could be a helpful adjunct. There's a question about whether they're having any effects on fat-free mass and fat mass independent of energy balance. I suspect they're probably not. So if they're not, then if you could use a very low dose to keep your appetite in check and make the whole contest prep and post-prep period smoother and less frustrating and exhausting and challenging, I'm surprised that they're not banned based on that. But they're also very helpful for a lot of people in terms of their general health. So it's a really difficult one to try and regulate. I think there are probably a few drugs that fall into that kind of category. And actually, just to go back to something I didn't mention earlier, there is also a question about whether they are affecting any of the hallmarks of aging independent of effects on energy balance, because it could be that they are somewhat. So they do seem to have some anti-inflammatory effects. And so if chronic inflammation is one of the hallmarks and they're affecting inflammation in different tissues, including, say, the brain, independent of any effects on energy balance, then it could be that they are actually geroprotective. And it's not just the consequence of the fact that people are eating less. But we need a lot more research on that. And I think some of that is now ongoing.
Interesting. Yeah, I think about them using them in the context of competition, and I don't like the idea of it because it's kind of like that's part of the competition, obviously, is kind of the suffering
Struggle.
through that part. And also my concern is that it might encourage people to make, like in some ways, the increase in hunger forces you to do certain things. Like it's almost like a bit of a feedback tool to be like, right, I should increase maybe my fiber content or have more plants and less of these other things. It might encourage people to not have the most well-rounded diets towards prep, and obviously you're suffering all the other things. Like you'll still have low energy levels, you'll still have those kind of symptoms, but it's, I don't know. Yeah, I think like you said, a low dose could be handy.
Yeah, and I also think that understanding the biology of those pathways has some implications for competitors. And so if you can target some of those pathways through existing nutraceuticals, albeit to a far lesser extent, then that could be advantageous. And there probably are some things that do that weekly. I mean, just take the example of increasing your protein intake and the effects of that on different satiety hormones, including GLP-1. That'd be one of them. But there are probably some supplements that are relevant to allulose, and some others come to mind. That's a conversation for another day.
And I agree with, and it's also, like you said, even the GPL-1, a lot of the people in my space that are concerned about it is when it comes with a lack of education of, right, you probably want to have a higher protein intake, maybe do some resistance training so that the weight loss is fat loss primarily, not lean tissue loss. And so again, like you said, that would harm your overall longevity if you're losing muscle mass at the same time as losing the weight. Maybe it would be counterbalanced by the fact you're so much healthier by losing that amount of adipose tissue and weight, but still it's like, hey, if we can, like you said, just get a win here and not have the loss, that education piece is important.
Yeah. I also think when your energy availability is that low, deep in prep, it would probably just make the whole experience easier. And competitors are so particular about hitting their macronutrient targets, they'd probably do so regardless. It will never get to the point where when you're sub 6% body fat, the effects of the drugs is so strong that it's overriding your appetite and you're failing to hit your macro targets. Don't think that's going to happen.
For sure. Absolutely. Yeah, I need to actually double check, but I think from last talking about it, whether or not it was banned, it seemed to be maybe on a watch list, or they hadn't like actually put their foot down on where it was. So I need to have a double check. Maybe one of the listeners will kind of come in and they know for sure. But to come on to the supplements you mentioned that are more easily available, is there anything there?
Yeah, there are. And obviously, some of these are going to be in the products that we come out with later in the year, which I will ship to you, Steve, and get your feedback on. You're gonna podcast forever. Listeners will be forever grateful to me for that. So, what are those? Well, some of them I think that are most helpful in a clinical context. Many people already be taking. I think that creatine is a great supplement for people as they get older. Possibly less so for its effects on the hallmarks of aging, although it definitely does target some of them, including deregulated nutrient sensing, mitochondrial dysfunction, and some others. But just thinking about human aging, frailty is really important. And if you look at people's prognoses after hip fractures, they're not good at all. I forget precisely how long average life expectancy is after a hip fracture late in life, but it's roughly a year. It's really not very long at all. And so if you're taking creatine for an extended period early in your life, and then as a result of that, you're building more fat-free mass, more skeletal muscle tissue, more bone tissue, and so on, then that's going to help protect you against that age-related frailty, which is great. But creatine is also good for many aspects of biology too, which fortunately is something that a lot more people are discussing nowadays, including your cognition, your mood, and so on. So creatine is one of them, and many will already be taking that. You've probably had many conversations about creatine specifically over the years. And I had a conversation with Darren Kandau about it for my podcast a while ago. You've probably spoken with him, have you?
He's on my list of someone I want to get on to talk about, do a deep dive onto it.
Yeah, he's a pro. I'd say that of the current contingent, he's probably doing more research on creatine than anyone else. And he really knows his stuff, so it'd be a good person to speak with. Of the other supplements that people might be taking that are interesting, I think glucosamine is quite interesting as a potential geroprotective agent. And there are lots of lines of evidence that point in that direction. So if you think about tissue specificity, then it does seem to reduce joint space narrowing in arthritis with continued use. The data are somewhat equivocal and some of the studies are quite low quality, but overall the evidence does support that. I think the most interesting evidence from my perspective is that people who supplement glucosamine live longer. If you look at the epidemiology of glucosamine use, this has been shown looking at several data sets, including the NHANES in the US. And there's always some residual confounder. You can't adjust for everything that could confound the relationship between use and lifespan. People will think, well, people who are taking glucosamine are more interested in their health in general. They've got healthier lifestyles, and so it's just an epiphenomenon. But I don't think that is the case based on that work. And it tends to show that people who take it, they have lower subsequent all-cause mortality, so risk of dying regardless of what the cause of death is. But they probably also have lower cardiovascular risk. And that might be because of effects of glucosamine on the glycocalyx, which lines blood vessels. It's a precursor for some of those molecules. And then also reduced cancer risk. And some things about glucosamine mimic the effects of calorie restriction. And so it could be that some of its protective effects are as a calorie restriction mimetic. Watch that space. But because we know a lot about safety, it's been used for a long time, because it's probably weakly beneficial for joint health, and because of the epidemiology, I think it's quite an easy win for a lot of people. And typical dose is something like 750 milligrams twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening. I'd argue that the evening dose is more important, just because if you look at joint symptoms, then people's joint flares tend to take place during the biological nighttime. The symptoms tend to be worse either shortly before bed or on waking in the morning. So glucosamine is an interesting one. And
Great.
then another, yeah.
Sorry, just on that one. Often I hear glucosamine and chondroitin consumed together. Chondroitin, sorry, I haven't actually, it hasn't come up for ages for me. I always knew it as like a weak support for joint health. So it's very interesting hearing about this. Is there any point using them synergistically together? Is there anything there?
Yeah, the chondroitin probably has a small additional positive effect. Probably. The glucosamine is doing the heavy lifting. And so just in the interest of trying to reduce people's personal expenses, I'd focus on the glucosamine, but you could take them both. Is there an additional benefit from the chondroitin? Possibly a very small one. Is there then an additional benefit from MSM? Probably not really. But yeah, glucosamine sulfate, that's the stuff that you're looking for.
Okay.
And it could be from a typical source, so it's historically been extracted from animals, but it could be a synthesized vegan source, like green grown glucosamine, if you're vegetarian or vegan. And then another one that some people might already be taking is taurine. It's another subject that I've covered on my own podcast. I had a conversation with BJ Yadav, who was the PI on a project studying taurine, which was published in the journal Science a couple of years ago, showing that taurine extended lifespan in mice. But he did a very comprehensive analysis with loads of experiments looking at all of the then hallmarks of aging. So it's the original set of the hallmarks of aging. And based on that, taurine did seem to target all of the hallmarks of aging. The interpretation of that, I think, matters, just because some of the experiments are more convincing than others. That's no criticism of EJ, that's just a general comment on studying those hallmarks. And then he looked at proxies of health span in the animals too, finding that those tended to be better with time. And he did some additional experiments on rhesus macaques, so a type of small monkey, showing that, again, there were improvements in a bunch of health span markers as the animals got older. But the thing that I find compelling about taurine, which is true of creatine and glucosamine as well, as the clinical evidence, we know a lot about safety. It's been studied for a long time. It is weakly ergogenic. So we know that it can improve endurance performance, especially in the heat, which I think is actually an underappreciated benefit. As the world gets hotter and hotter, people are going to experience more and more heat stress. And our ability to cope with that as we get older dwindles. And so if people are taking taurine late in life and it improves their thermoregulatory capacity, then I see that as being a win. And it seems to affect sweat gland morphology and some other things that help people dissipate heat. So I think taurine is likely beneficial for that aspect of health. But it has some positive effects on cardiometabolic health. It can reduce blood pressure, slightly improve blood lipids. It affects bile acid metabolism a little bit. And it seems to potentially improve performance and strength of power exercise a little bit too. There was a study of female rugby players recently showing that it could improve some power metrics. And so if you put all of that together, plus the fact that it's inexpensive at the moment, when the Hubermans and the Atirs of the world start talking about taurine more, the price will probably inflate massively. So you could stockpile it now if you wanted to. I think taurine is an incredibly easy win. And again, great safety profile. It's approved by the different regulatory bodies, including the EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority. And then there are a few that wouldn't be so widely used by people and probably relate more to the function of certain organ systems than others, bearing in mind the specificity of aging in different tissues. But of the other general candidates, one that I think is fascinating and I think is going to boom in popularity in the next few years is ergothioneine, which is an amino acid thiol present in mushrooms and in very small amounts in some other foods too. And it's in some ways a little bit like glutathione. And historically, people thought that it was exerting positive effects by functioning as an antioxidant, but that idea is a bit less compelling than it used to be. There are a few things that make ergothioneine really interesting. One is that, like taurine and some of these other things, levels in the blood and some tissues tend to go down with age. Another is that, again, if you look at the epidemiology of ergothioneine intake, and also there have been some nice studies looking at metabolomics too, where you look at the sum of all metabolites in different tissues like the blood and how those relate to different health outcomes. Once more, it seems that people with higher ergothioneine levels in the blood have better health outcomes in years to come. And it could be that there's an intergenerational effect too. So ergothioneine is actually passed on to the next generation by way of breast milk. And more important, maybe, the body really values ergothioneine. So it has a transporter for it, which might well be specific to ergothioneine. Sometimes it's called the ergothioneine transporter. Sometimes it's called OCTN1. And cells, therefore, will hungrily take ergothioneine up into them and into different compartments within the cells. One of them is the mitochondria. And then they hold on to them. So they accumulate the ergothioneine over time. So it's one of these things like creatine that gets better with repeated use. And so all of that is very interesting. But then the question is, well, what are the effects on function? And the preclinical studies, so looking at rats and mice and other animals, are very positive. And there have now been a few lifespan experiments showing lifespan extension too, as well as improvements in proxies of health span over time. When I say health span, probably should have specified this up front, but you could think of that as being the period of life where you're free from chronic disease. And so the longer that period is, the longer your health span is. But it's a messy definition. That's the most widely used one. But the reality is that a lot of us come in and out of disease. And so it's not like there's some bright line in the sand beyond which you've lost your health span. But now there are a few clinical studies that are ongoing, and there have been a couple that have been published recently showing that ergothioneine improves brain function in people. And it seems to have an excellent safety profile, of course. The doses of ergothioneine that you probably need to supplement are consistent with what you'd get from a modest intake of certain mushrooms anyway. And so we're not talking about heroic doses relative to what you would get from food alone. But if you're not regularly consuming mushrooms, then you're probably more likely to benefit from it. And then relevant to exercise, there have now been a couple of studies showing that as animals get older, if you add ergothioneine to their nutrition, then physically they function better. They not only have better endurance performance, but they have more muscle mass and greater strength too. That's typically assessed through a measure of strength endurance. So when you put all of that together, ergothioneine is really, really interesting. And I think that we'll see several studies, probably with doses ranging from about 5 to 25 milligrams of ergothioneine, reporting all sorts of benefits. And one of the nice things about ergothioneine is that it seems to be improving things that otherwise have been hard to improve. And so one of them is cognitive frailty. Like if you think about dementia and Alzheimer's, then the solutions that we've come up with so far for those ailments have been rubbish. There's been a huge amount of money invested in them, but the therapies just haven't worked very well. And I think ergothioneine is one of the more promising candidates. So I think it's a particularly good candidate for brain aging. But again, given the ubiquity of the ergothioneine transporter, it seems to have systemic effects. And I'm much more bullish about it than I am most supplements. And I'll just mention a couple more. One of them is astaxanthin, which is a marine carotenoid. It's the pigment that makes salmon pink, for instance, but you can supplement it. Similar to ergothioneine, the dose that you need is similar to what you would get by way of foods if you were consuming astaxanthin-rich foods on a regular basis anyway.
Sorry, Greg. What foods would include that? Salmon, would that be one?
Yeah, it's basically seafood.
Okay.
Yeah, salmon is certainly one of the better sources. And there have been a few clinical studies. The quality of some of those is quite low. One of the issues with many of those studies is that it's not astaxanthin in isolation. It's been combined with other nutraceuticals in several instances, so it's hard to pass the relative contribution of astaxanthin. But again, it seems to extend lifespan, and that's been shown in the gold standard assessment too, the interventions testing program that I mentioned earlier. The human data show that it's very safe. Again, it's approved by these different bodies. Once more, there are reasons to think that it could be weakly ergogenic. It's probably a good thing for your physical appearance. So, and this might well be true of ergothioneine as well, but astaxanthin can protect the skin against oxidative damage from UV radiation. And so, like other carotenoids like lycopene, it's probably a good thing to consume if you're getting lots of sun on your skin. It's probably going to reduce any sunburn that you get, and possibly in turn reduce things like wrinkling over time. It's hypothetical, but there are good reasons to think that. So that would be another good candidate. And then one more that I just think is fascinating, and this is the only other nutraceutical that I've done a podcast on, is lithium. And lithium has got a very storied history, and it's been a bit stigmatized because it's used therapeutically to treat bipolar disorder as a mood stabilizing agent. But lithium is something that we all consume some of, and some of us consume quite a lot of, typically by way of the water supply, but it also therefore makes its way into some foods too. And in some places, the water concentrations are really quite high, in particular in parts of South America. But in some places, they're next to non-existent. Once more, if you look at the epidemiology of lithium intake, then there's a relationship between how much people consume and how long they live. And some of that is probably mediated by risk of suicide. So going back to mood stabilization, lithium seems to reduce risk of suicide based on those cross-sectional studies and prospective studies, which is really interesting because suicide is otherwise not really something that we have known interventions for nutritionally. Physical activity and other factors obviously affect mood quite strongly. But I can't think of another nutraceutical that has been shown to affect risk of suicide. Could be that some do, but the data for lithium are most compelling by far. And so that is fascinating. And again, there have been lots of clinical studies. Many of these are in clinical populations, so people with bipolar, for instance. Interestingly, if you look at some of those studies, then people who take lithium have some lower measures of biological age than their peers who are treated with alternative medications. So there's another signal there. And then people are looking at it as a neuroprotective agent. Once more, returning to the idea that we don't have good interventions for conditions like Alzheimer's disease. Lithium has been studied for its effects on Alzheimer's patients and patients with cognitive dysfunction, and been shown to reduce progression towards cognitive frailty. So it's probably particularly good for the aging brain. And therefore, given that the doses of lithium that you seem to need for these positive effects are very, very low, it's probably a very easy win. But there are regulatory issues. In some countries, you can buy lithium just as a member of the general population over the counter through dietary supplements. For example, Swanson make a lithium orotate product. Life Extension makes a lithium product. In other countries, and this is true of the UK, it's not so readily available because salts of lithium, like lithium carbonate, are used as therapies for bipolar disorder. The doses that you need for the beneficial effects, if you don't have bipolar, are vanishingly small compared to the bipolar doses, though. So while there is a real toxicity concern, although certainly the benefits outweigh the downsides, at higher doses, and again, this is true of many different medications, including the alternative medications to lithium, at those low doses, there's no concern about toxicity. Once more, the doses that I'm talking about are lower than what you get in drinking water in many parts of the world. And actually, I think the optimal dose for a lot of people is probably about 400 micrograms a day. It's a tiny, tiny dose, which is a hard dose to find from a supplement because the supplements tend to be 1 to 5 milligrams a day. So I think a low dose of lithium is probably a really good idea for brain health in the long term as well. Those are just a few of them. There are lots more. And
wow.
if you ask me about specific tissues, and I could be much more precise, but I don't know why. I think maybe this is partly a British thing, but I think I naturally vie for the underdog. I want to see the underdogs do well. And when I look at geroprotectors and gerotherapies, there are some that get loads of attention, like nicotinamide riboside, nicotinamide mononucleotide, metformin, rapamycin, a few others. And I just don't think they're the best of the bunch by any means. And there are all these that are relatively neglected, which I think are so much more promising because people who have healthy lifestyles are likely to benefit from these others too. And there are some other factors that I haven't mentioned too. One of them that I'll just add quickly because I realise that once more I'm going on, is that there's a intriguing concept called antagonistic pleiotropy. Some people call it pleiotropy. antagonistic just means opposing, and pleiotropy just means something has many effects. So if you talk about a gene that's antagonistically pleiotropic, it just means that some of the effects are beneficial and some of the effects are detrimental. And in the case of antagonistically pleiotropic genes, the idea is that some things that are good for you early in life can be bad for you late in life. I mentioned initially at the outset that the theories on aging can be split in different ways. And one way they can be split is into theories that put forward the idea that aging is in some way programmed. And a lot of these relate to antagonistic pleiotropy. Things that are good for us early in life that support reproduction are bad for us late in life. And so it could be that there are lots of gene variants that we have that improve reproductive fitness, and all that evolution really cares about is passing on genetic information. And so as soon as the reproductive years are over, evolution is just blind to the rest of it. It just doesn't give a shit, really. And therefore, the idea, or one implication of this, is that if we're targeting some of these antagonistically pleiotropic genes in order to delay aging, then we could actually compromise our reproductive fitness early in life. And I speak with and consult some people who are taking every potential gerotherapy under the sun in their 30s. They're taking their rapamycin, they're taking their metformin, the list goes on. And I just think you shouldn't be doing this now. You need to keep levers to pull in the future. And there are reasons to think that this could be bad for your reproductive function at this point in life. The things that I mentioned there, though, creatine, taurine, astaxanthin, ergothioneine, I don't see that being the case with them. So I see them as benefiting performance in general, being good for the function of lots of different tissues. And we don't know how they interact yet. That's a really important consideration, because most of us speaking or listening to this will be taking multiple supplements at once. But that's true of lots of different supplements. So I just think, look at your budget, look at what matters to you, and think about your personal disease risk based on family history and so on. And then you can start to look at some of these candidate geroprotectors and pick ones that make some sense for you. And I think the ones that I've mentioned there are ones that are actually going to be really good matches for a lot of people listening to this.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot there for sure. And I know if people are really interested, and I have listened to them, you did a complete deep dive on taurine, on lithium as well on your podcast. And actually what you just mentioned, the antagonistic effect, I know you had a chat with, I forget his last name, but Steve, who I really enjoyed both first and second parts of that. And I thought that was really interesting, in fact, in that, like, yeah, you might be this is my really simple analogy, Greg, is it kind of aligns, and it doesn't align perfectly, but it aligns with the discussion, is if people get a hair transplant too early because they're receding and what have you on top, but that could keep receding for a long time until like they have to get another one, and you can only apparently have so many or something, and it could basically, you can do something too soon, and that's the only way I can think about it along the same lines of my very simple mind of one of the ways people try and battle anti-aging or aging even.
Makes sense.
And so I was also thinking, like you said there, I was thinking through, what do I do? So mushrooms, I actually probably have like 600 grams of mushrooms a week because I get through like 2 containers. I have them on my omelets, eat salmon regularly. I was just looking at my Monster on the side here, which whether or not this is a good thing, but yeah, it has taurine in for sure. And
what's
so
the dose
I wonder,
though? Is it about 1 gram?
I actually don't know how much taurine I was trying to see it off in the corner of my eye. It's probably very low because I don't know if it even references it.
I think Red Bull contains 1 gram.
It's probably similar to Red Bull,
which is on the low side. So for the ergogenic effects, you're probably looking at 3 to 6 grams. And the nice thing about this in the context of aging is that if you extrapolate from Yadav's experiments on lifespan in mice, then you fall it right the same dose range. And for a 70 kilogram person, the equivalent dose is between about 3 and 6 grams. So I don't know whether it's best to split the dose. I know that VJ's got an ongoing clinical trial where he's giving people 2 grams in the morning and 2 grams in the evening. I personally just take 4 grams early in the day because I suspect that it probably supports performance and subsequent exercise a little bit. Some people find it very weakly sedating. I don't personally notice that at all. I think a lot of that is a nocebo effect. I think people are anticipating things to influence them. And I'm not convinced that that is the case there. So the dose that you'll get from Red Bull and Monster is probably a little bit too low. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend nailing 4 cans of Monster in order to get your taurine. I think there's probably a better way.
The trade-off for sleep, Greg, it's definitely not worth it though.
No.
So yeah, I was just thinking through things I already am doing and kind of getting probably decent amounts, like creatine, obviously already supplementing with, glucosamine, probably something easily can incorporate, and then some of those latter ones I definitely have to look into. I don't think the water, from remembering the podcast, the water in the UK is not as rich in lithium as others.
It's not massively high. No, and full disclosure, I take lithium intermittently, but typically 1 milligram because that's the dose that I can take, and I wouldn't see the need to take that year round because let's say that the optimal dose is around 400 micrograms. If we disregard the small amounts that you're getting from water and food, based on those clinical trials that have been done, well, if the lowest dose that you can get in a dietary supplement is 1 milligram of elemental lithium, then that's 2.5 times the 400 microgram dose. And therefore, if you took it every 2.5 days, that probably puts you around the optimal dose. And therefore, I think it's just something that you can just use on and off basis, or you could just take it several times a week, and that's fine.
Yeah. Do you have any concerns over the control on supplements? I know in the US in particular, like it's so unregulated, the market over there. Is there anything, thoughts surrounding that?
Yeah, I certainly do have thoughts. And I realised that there are a couple more things that we wanted to get to today. One of them
might have to be another episode. I don't know.
Yeah, one of them was training and longevity, and another was plastics, nanoplastics, microplastics. And the reason I mentioned that is because just this morning I saw a study that looked at the concentrations of small plastic particles in dietary fibre supplements in Australia, finding the presence of very small plastic fragments in all of the products they tested, which is just
can't escape it.
Yeah, you can't. And the more that I look at research on plastic, the more I'm convinced that it's really, really, really bad news. And I don't think that I'm someone that's prone to hyperbole. And I also never want to be the person that makes people worried about things that they shouldn't be worried about at all. But plastic is a concern, in part because it's just accumulating in our environment over time. It's accumulating people's bodies over time. There's been some really interesting work looking at people who passed away at different points in time, showing that people who passed away more recently had higher plastic concentrations in their brain. And so it's probable that as the years go by, we're just exposed to more and more of it, especially as it continues to break down. Because secondary plastics, which are made from the initial plastic products, they just get worn down and worn down and worn down and then redistributed in the atmosphere by wind and water and so on. And they end up everywhere, including accumulating in our bodies because they don't have good mechanisms to dispose of them. So that just is another example of the fact that supplement contamination is a thing, but the things that we should be concerned about within supplements might be shifting over time. Once upon a time, it might be dodgy hydroxycut products that are contaminated with PEDs or with fat loss agents, thermogenics. Now we might need to be worried about things that are slightly different. And I don't know if the third-party testing bodies like the NSF are testing for some of those contaminants too. I need to look into that. I've got that on my to-do list, but yes, I agree that contamination is an issue. If you're concerned about that, then you can look for products that have been tested by a third party. like Informed Sport in the UK. I doubt that they're testing for things like microplastics, if I'm being honest, but at least you'll know that you're probably not going to get a positive drug test if you use one of those supplements and you're a tested athlete. There are some supplement companies that consistently check out. If you look at Consumer Lab, for instance, then Life Extension products, Swanson products, Now products, they always seem to be free of the contaminants that they test for. So I just default to recommending certain brands, and I have faith in those brands, and I've got no vested interest whatsoever in that. I just think that they make good products. Sometimes I look at their formulations and I don't love some of the multi-ingredient formulations they put forward, but they all have good versions of the basics that most people might be interested in supplementing. Fish oil, magnesium, creatine, taurine, all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so I just gravitate back to that and tend to nudge people in those directions.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. The more reputable the company, the bigger risk they have to their brand being tarnished if something was to come out, or they're less likely to cut corners. They can charge a little bit more. So often it is more expensive to go with them. But like you said, you're kind of risking something if you're unsure about another supplement company. So I think that's well said. And like you said, the Consumer Lab reports don't lie. So if they've consistently been showing to perform well there, that's a really good thing. It's a shame about not many companies go with Informed Sport. I imagine it's quite an expensive process to have that done.
It is an expensive process. And the other thing is that from an insider's perspective, if you see two products and one of them is Informed Sport tested and the other isn't, like My Protein, Impact Whey Protein versus Impact Whey Protein Elite,
yes,
it's precisely the same product, but you'll pay the premium on the Elite product because it's been tested. So I know from the inside that there's no difference in that whatsoever. They just have to send off a certain number of batches to Informed Sport for testing each time. But if there is the alternative version of that product that hasn't been tested, then personally I'd be perfectly comfortable consuming that product, and that's what I tend to do. So that's a helpful seal of approval for people who aren't drug tested. I don't know if it's worth that additional regulatory loop to jump through, and you could just save yourself a little bit of money by getting the non-tested version of that product if it's from a reputable manufacturer.
Yeah, and I like you said, a lot of the people listening do like all these concoctions of pre-workouts and all these mixes with very little evidence to suggest they're doing all too much. So I think, like you said, go for like the pinpointed ingredient, buy taurine, get the right dose. Don't try and buy a pre-workout that might contain some taurine and a bunch of other stuff and it's all mixed in, especially if it's a proprietary blend and you don't even know how much you're getting.
Oh, so some of the proprietary blends out there are brilliant. I mean, let's just name them. Good old AG1, which I didn't spell out early on, but I haven't looked at their product for a while. But I remember, like some other products in the market, there was this blend of different plant extracts, and the total mass of the blend was something laughably small. It was like 500 milligrams or something. There are like 20 ingredients listed in there, and I'm not saying it precisely how it is, but as someone that knows something about the supplement industry, I just looked at that and just held my head in my hands and thought, people read that and they think that they're getting all the polyphenolic benefits from these different plant constituents. I despair.
Yes, especially when it's kind of touted that like you could have this instead of fruit and veg. It's like, oh wow, like that's not great. Greg, I know I've taken a lot of your time. I know you've got another appointment, so we'll have to touch on some of those topics that you mentioned there at the end another time, which I think the listeners would be really intrigued to talk about. Especially the microplastics is something I'm becoming more aware of, and I was hoping it was just something that would be like, it's just biohackers, kind of hyperbole, but it seems like it's going to be a larger concern. So I think it'd be great for me to kind of dive into that with you on another time. But thank you so much, Greg. If people want to keep up to date with the work that you're doing, I know on Instagram in particular, you share kind of various pieces of literature that you've been kind of reading and stuff. So if people want to kind of keep up to date with that, they should head to your Instagram. But is there anywhere else?
Yeah, I just nudge people towards the podcast, Reason and Wellbeing.
Of course.
And yes, I am on Instagram at Greg Potter PhD. Any questions, you can send me a DM, no issues. And yeah, thanks for the opportunity, mate. It's been nice to catch up. It's been too long since
Absolutely.
I saw that lovely face of yours.
Thank you guys for listening. Thank you, Greg. I'll make sure all of those sources are linked in the description. And guys, if you have any particular questions, particularly on microplastics or anything we've discussed here, as you've heard, we're going to do another episode at some point, and we can help to answer those. So thank you very much. We'll catch you in the next episode.